Okay. So let me say a couple of things. Let me just read out Greg's bio. He will be too humble to say that, but Gregory Sandler is the president of Reason IO, a company that puts philosophy into practice. He's the editor of Stoicism Today and the producer of Half Hour Hegel series and teaches at Milwaukee Institute of Art and Design. His popular philosophy focused YouTube channel has over 80,000 subscribers. His videos have more than 7.5 million views. Wow. All right. So, Greg, welcome. Over to you.
Thanks for inviting me in here. And, you know, it's nice to follow after Bill and Donald. They're both really, great researchers on Stoicism. And I noticed that you got Walter's name right. That's always difficult to do.
That was just an accident. Give me just a second, Greg. Let me just tell
Sure.
people about the format. So what we're going to do today, we're going to have lots of people. So what we're going to do is that Greg is going to do a presentation and then he will take Q&A. Now, please go ahead. There are going to be lots of questions. Like every Saturday, we get overwhelmed with questions. So if you have questions, enter your questions in chat now, okay? And keep on entering the questions. And believe me, we will come to all the questions, okay? So we'll do that. And after the Q&A, we are going to break up into small groups of about 6 people each, so we can discuss these ideas and their application to our lives in great amount of detail. All right. So with that, back to you, Greg.
Thanks. So the topic that I wanted to talk about is one that's really central to Stoic philosophy and practice, and sometimes gets misunderstood. So I thought this would be a useful opportunity to do some clarification. And it's very simple. It's what's good, what's bad, and then what's indifferent, which sounds like a very simple trichotomy to work with. And it's not just an important aspect for Stoicism as such, but in virtue ethics in general, people are mixed up about what's good and bad and how to choose and prioritize between them. But the Stoics introduced this wrinkle into it using this term, the indifference, that was really distinctive to them. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to be giving an overview of what the classical and canonical Stoics thought and taught about what's good and what's bad and what's indifferent, which is a little bit more complicated than some of the ways in which it gets presented. And then I'm also going to, here and there, I'm going to try to address some common misunderstandings of these, particularly about the range of the indifference. So what's good and what's bad from a Stoic perspective is what I'm going to start with, and then we'll talk about how it's connected to other key concepts. And then we'll talk about this whole realm of the indifference and why do they pick this term, the indifference. Then we'll talk about the different ranges of value within the indifference. You might say some indifferents are less indifferent than others, either towards the good or towards the bad. And then we'll talk about something that the Stoics called use, and it's how we translate this very important term, khresis, that I'll talk about. And that'll lead into discussion of the virtues and their relationship to the indifference. And then finally, I'll talk about what gets translated as duties or appropriate actions and how those bear upon the indifference. So if we're thinking about what's good and what's bad, if we think about virtue ethics in general, we can also say this about religious traditions and about psychotherapy, which has very early roots in ancient philosophy as well, in some cases. Part of what the big project is helping people understand and move towards genuine, not just apparent goods, and away from genuine bads or evils and not just apparent ones, to extricate themselves from what's really bad. And so that's an important thing to sort of bring in. Another key thing is to be able to frame things in terms of higher or lower or greater or lesser goods and evils, goods and bads. This is a matter of prioritization, and that's just as important to ethics as figuring out what it actually is good and bad. So, if we get away from the Stoics and we think about pleasure, for example, the Platonists, the Aristotelians, they would say that pleasure is a good, it's not the good. And so we have to figure out where does it fit into how we ought to structure our lives. We don't want to reject it entirely, but we don't want to be dominated by the desire for pleasure. Stoics have a different view on pleasure, which we can talk about in a bit. And Stoicism seems kind of like an outlier among ancient philosophy, since they use this term, the indifference, and they lump a lot of things into it. So on the one side, we have the things that are genuinely good, on the other side, things that are genuinely bad, and then we have this vast space in between. Now, sometimes you'll hear people trying to summarize Stoicism, and they'll say that Stoicism teaches that virtue is the only good. That's not quite true. The Stoics did recognize other things as being good besides virtue, but virtue is, you might say, paramount among what's good. So if you look at Cicero and the Stoic paradoxes, the very first Stoic paradox is only what is noble, or only what is right is good. In Latin, quod honestum sit in solum bonum esse, right? So virtues fit in there, but they're not the only thing that's good. And the opposite of the virtues, vices, are bad, but they're not the only thing that's bad. Before I jump into talking about all this, I do want to say a little bit, since people may or may not have a lot of exposure to Stoicism. If you want to see relatively systematic summaries of what the Stoics did in fact think, the places to go to are Diogenes Laertes' Lives of the Philosophers, book 7, Arius Didymus's Epitome of Stoic Ethics, some of Cicero's works like On Ends, On Duties, and the Tusculan Disputations, and then we have some of the big heavy hitters that people dive into when they're reading about Stoicism, Seneca and Epictetus. Marcus Aurelius, the Meditations, are a really wonderful book, but they don't present things in a very systematic way at all. So, if you want to do a deeper dive, Epictetus and Seneca are the places that you go. So coming back to talking about virtues, virtues are definitely on the side of the good, and vices are definitely on the side of the bad. And the Stoics recognized 4 main types of virtue and vice. They associated these with what we call the cardinal virtues, wisdom or practical wisdom, depending on how you translate it, temperance, justice, and courage. And, there are corresponding vices, folly or foolishness, sometimes translated as stupidity, lack of self-control or self-indulgence, cowardice, and injustice. And those things are considered to be definitely good and definitely bad by the Stoics. And each of them is divided into, you might call them sub-virtues or different modalities of virtues. So for example, earlier today in the Stoic parents group, we were talking about courage, and the Stoics divided courage up into a number of different things. Only one of which actually has to do with dealing with fear, being able to get through the daily slog or grind and persevere in that. That's another part of that virtue of courage. And so these are good things for us. What else are good? Well, the Stoics thought that certain emotions or passions were good or bad. Actions are good or bad, very often reflecting virtues or vices. People themselves can be classified as good or bad. Friendship and hatred, as we're going to talk about in a bit, are good or bad. And then, of course, there's certain things that you could call them the overarching states that we're aiming at, like happiness and tranquility and freedom, good things, right? And misery, being disturbed by things, slavery or a lack of freedom, those are bad. So the Stoics talked about, a wide range of things that are, in fact, good or bad. And they talked about them in a variety of ways. Sometimes they framed it in terms of means and ends, or being productive of things, or being things that were good in themselves. Sometimes they used the term participation, which is always a little bit murky when we try to figure out what it means. I'd like to talk a little bit about some of the other things besides virtues that are good and bad, because that'll help us then see what's neither. So the emotions. I mentioned that the Stoics think that some emotions are good and some emotions are bad. Again, common misunderstanding of the Stoics says that the Stoics think that we should get rid of our emotions or repress them. That definitely is not what they taught. But they thought that some of our emotional states and emotional reactions are subversive of reason or resistant to reason. They lead us off into tracks that are not good for us, and very often vicious. So those would be considered bad. But there are some good emotions, the eupathe, and those would be, for example, caution. Instead of feeling irrational fear or anxiety, there are some cases where we ought to feel some fear because it's genuinely rational to do so. Or joy, another very important thing. The Stoics are not joyless or loveless or anything like that. That is an integral part of it. So the emotions can fall into both sides. We can also talk about actions themselves. Are they in accordance with our social nature, aligned with virtue? And the Stoics made some, distinctions there that we can go into if you'd like to later on, between things that are totally virtuous and then actions that are just in accordance with virtue, kind of similar to what Aristotle does in the Nicomachean Ethics. Epictetus, a very important late Stoic thinker, talks about good and evil for human beings lying within the scope of our faculty of choice, or sometimes it's translated moral purpose, the khresis, the part of us that does the choosing, which for Epictetus is basically the same as the ruling part of ourselves. And another thing that's classified as good or bad in a real sense is friendship. Friendship and its opposite, hatred or enmity. And this is where we get to something quite interesting. Friendship is classified, strictly speaking, as something external to ourselves. It makes sense, right? Our friend is not us. However, we may talk about being two souls, one soul and two bodies, or any of that Aristotelian stuff. The Stoics recognize that our relationships are between separate people. But friendship is indeed something that is quite good, and so the friends are classified among good things. Not friendship in a lower sense, for the sake of what we might call common benefit, where I give you something and you give me something, but where it's genuine friendship. That is something that is good both in the relationship and in the state that I have within myself of being friendly with the other person. So what then is the middle part? We've got the good on one side and the bad on the other side. The Stoics talk about indifference, and that's a translation of the Greek term adiaphoria, literally meaning the things that don't make a difference. So these are things, there's a lot of different characterizations of this, but one of them, coming from Diogenes Laertes, is that these are things that are neither good nor evil or bad, things that don't benefit or harm a person. And he clarifies that the Stoics actually say there's two different meanings to this term indifferent. There are things that don't contribute at all to our happiness or unhappiness. We can be happy or unhappy without them, but the use of them in certain ways contributes to happiness or misery. And a great example of this would be wealth, which we'll talk about a bit later. You can pile up as much money as you want, and it won't make you happy if you're already a miserable person. As a matter of fact, it might make it easier for you to be miserable in new and exciting ways. And vice versa. If you're poor and you are a good person, somebody who is free, who's untroubled, being poor is not going to make things worse, but you can use that money in such ways that it conduces to good things, right? So no amount of wealth or pleasure or bodily health or physical attractiveness is going to tip you over the scale into happiness, but it can be used for that, and we're going to get back to that in just a moment. Then there's things that are, you might say, even more indifferent, things that have no power to stir our inclinations or choices towards or against them. And, if we look at examples, the Stoics, the stock ones are wealth versus poverty, pain versus pleasure, health versus illness, living or dying, high social status versus low social status, being given great positions, being in menial positions, physical attractiveness, physical ugliness. All of those things fall in the realm of the indifferent. And, you know, like I was saying, why are these indifferent? Well, they can possess a certain value, but they don't possess enough value, no matter how many of them you pile up or connect with each other, to make us happy or miserable in the genuine sense. And as persons, they don't make us good or bad either. Epictetus actually has a really nice sort of deconstruction of mistaken lines of reasoning when he says, people say to themselves, I have more money than you, therefore I'm better than you, when really the only thing that you can draw as a conclusion is that they can buy more things than you can, right? These are not actually connected up. And so part of Stoic analysis is disentangling these things from each other and seeing indifference as indifference. Now, there's kind of a common mistake, I think, that's largely due to our language. We see this term indifference, ending in the plural, and we think that means we automatically ought to feel indifferent towards those things. And that doesn't actually follow for Stoic philosophy. There were some ancient philosophers who did see things that way, but they weren't the Stoics. There's also a tendency to map certain categories. Once you start learning about Stoicism, you learn about the dichotomy of control, what's in my power, what's not in my power. You learn about internals and externals. And it's really easy to say, oh, well, those all connect up with each other. What's indifferent is what's external, is what's not in my control. Not completely. Those are overlapping categories, but they're not, you might say, coinciding categories. So we have to think about, do indifferents have any sort of value at all? And the Stoics say that they do. Some of them do, at least. Some of them don't. So there are some genuinely indifferent matters. And I'd invite you to think about, as I go through these examples, think about things that you don't care about one way or another. And it's not because you're pushing it away and rejecting it. It just doesn't matter to you at all. So some of the classic examples that the Stoics give, whether the number of the hairs on your head is even or odd, who cares? That doesn't make a difference to anything that we could possibly think of. You could construe some situation in which that might matter, like let's say the government decides that all the even-numbered hair people are going into one field and all the odd are going into another, and then people who don't have any hair, I suppose, they'd have to have a third category for. But that's so artificial, it doesn't really connect up with us. Whether your finger is straight or bent, they say, who cares? It doesn't matter. Picking up something along the way, like a twig or a leaf, is another example that they give. Now, that applies to a lot of things. They really are genuinely indifferent. We have no stake in them at all. Then, here's where it starts to get tricky. Then there's things that are indifferent, and the Stoics were willing to say that they were indifferent, but they have some sort of value. And the word that's used there in Greek is axia, meaning something that has some sort of stake, some sort of value. It's worth something. And they talked about what we translate as preferred and rejected indifference. So these could have positive or negative value, but they weren't going to be of the sort that would actually cross the threshold into what's genuinely good or bad. The place, by the way, if you really want to see the best discussion of this to go to, is in Cicero's work on the ends, where he's having Cato, the great Stoic statesman and philosopher, presenting the Stoic doctrine on this. That's probably one of the best places to go to. Book 3 of that work. So a lot of these indifferents do, in fact, have some value, some positive or negative value. They don't have the same kind of value. You might actually think about it like a two-tiered system, where you've got, what's genuinely good or bad up here. It can really determine whether we are happy or miserable. And then we've got everything else down here. And there are, higher and lower within it, and we can trade them off against each other. But no matter how much of that we accumulate or, manage to get rid of, we're not going to be happy or miserable on account of that. So how do we clarify the value that they have then? That's one of the central questions for the Stoics. And one of the terms that they use that, again, I think a lot of people get mixed up about is they use this framework of in accordance with nature, or in contradiction to nature, or out of harmony with nature, however you want to translate it, contrary to nature. So this is actually a very complex notion for the Stoics. And when they're using this notion of in accordance with nature, they don't just mean accepting, the universe as it is, because we're also part of that nature. Human beings, in our capacity for development, are part of that nature. They don't mean nature in the sense like when we see somebody doing a bad thing and we say, that's human nature, people are jerks. That would actually be contrary to nature for the Stoics. So think about what a fully developed, fully realized human being would be like, and that provides us with a model for what is in accordance with nature. Arius Didymus tells us that some things can be in accordance with nature as such, others by participation. And so he gives as examples of that having a steady hand and a healthy body. It's the way things ought to be developing, but you can still be happy without having a hand that doesn't shake or a body that's not in the best shape entirely. Seneca in letter 119 tells us that what is good is what is in accordance with nature, but what is in accordance with nature is not immediately good as well. There are some things that are in accordance with nature that stem from the kind of creatures that we are and our interface with the world that aren't automatically good. What's going to make them good is some sort of connection to the virtues. Diogenes Laertius tells us that indifferents that are preferred contribute to what he calls harmonious living. He also tells us that some preferred indifferents are because they're for the sake of something else. There's something useful. So we might think here about money, which we're going to talk about again a little bit later. Money is not a bad thing. It's not a good thing either. It's an indifferent from the Stoic perspective, but it's a preferred indifferent. Because when you have money, you can use it to purchase things that you need. You can use it to accomplish tasks that actually are your duties or moral obligations. It can be used within the service of virtue. It can also be misused, right? A vicious person with money is in a bad state. It's probably better that they don't have too much money because they can accomplish much more harm with it. But money can actually be, quite useful. It can be conducive to other types of things that could, in fact, be genuine goods. Or it can be good for purchasing other preferred indifference or keeping at bay other rejected indifference. Interestingly, another thing that they talk about as being a preferred indifferent, and I think this helps to give us a bit of perspective, moral progress or moral development. In Greek, it's prokopen, and we get the word prokoptes, meaning the person who's not yet a sage, if there are indeed any sages, but the person who's in the process of development, the person who's studying Stoicism. That is also a preferred indifferent, according to the Stoics, because it's not yet there in terms of virtue and vice. Seneca later on in his letters, in letter 82, talks about death, and he says that death is an indifferent, and he recognizes that it is a hard sell. He says that it's among the things that are not bad, but they have a semblance of badness. There's all these things that we, in our normal natural attitude, we view as bad by themselves, even though if we analyze them, perhaps they're not. And so he says it's not something that we can easily ignore. And the last thing I'll say about the value of indifference is that those that are either preferred or rejected, they do have a value of, you might call it exchange or transaction in relation to each other. So Diogenes of Babylon, and then again, this is in Cicero's On the Ends, says that, again, wealth is quite good because you can, in fact, use it to purchase things that will make you healthy. if you think about buying medicine, right? Or you can use it for other things that are preferred indifference. The one thing that you can't do with it, well, actually two things you can't do with it. The one of them is you can't become virtuous just by purchasing something. And you also can't keep yourself from being vicious by accumulating wealth and spending it. But it is so, it's very useful for all sorts of other things. And we can say similar things about our capacities or our skills that we learn, right? Or our bodily attributes. All of these things are, in fact, valuable in some sense. They're just at that lower tier. So if we think about what we're supposed to do with indifference, one of the things that I mentioned a little bit earlier that's quite important for the Stoics is what they called khresis in Greek. And in Latin, it's usus. And we translate this typically by the word use. It's a little bit misleading because it also means dealing with or the attitude that we take to things or the application that we make of them. And so Epictetus is actually one of the best people in talking about this. There's an entire chapter in his discourses. It's book 2, chapter 6, that is devoted, it's called On Indifference in Things, just adiaphoria in Greek. And so he's telling us what indifference, as opposed to indifferents, with the plural S, means. And he gives you an example of the hypothetical syllogism. So I don't know if any of you have ever done logic or not. Probably quite a few of you have. And people do get worked up about logic, believe it or not, in philosophy classes and in other venues as well. A lot of times that's probably misplaced because, in itself, who cares? It's not that important of a thing, the hypothetical syllogism. But the judgments, he says, that we make about them, they're not indifferent. So we can have something that in itself is indifferent, but the attitude that we take towards it, the approach that we have, the use that we make of it is not indifferent. Epictetus tells us that we really need to be careful not to be lackadaisical, is the way we can translate it. His term there is ameles, not giving care to something. We don't want to be careless when it comes to indifferent things because the use of them is not indifferent. So we've got things that are indifferent, but what we do with them, the uses that we make of them, is definitely not indifferent and has a great effect on us, morally speaking. In an earlier chapter, in chapter 5 of book 2, he says that the materials that we work with are indifferent, but the use that we make of them is not indifferent. And he suggests that what we ought to do is imitate those who play games. And he has in mind a dice game. We don't know exactly what game it is. Clearly, it involved counters of some sort. So maybe it was like backgammon or something. And then he also talks about playing the ball game. And he uses Socrates defending himself in the law court as an example of somebody who's playing the ball game well. The game itself doesn't matter as such, but playing it well, that is up to us, and that is something important. So there's all these things that are indifference, and in themselves they don't have value, but we give them value by what we do with them. And it can be positive value or it can be negative value. The things that are indifference could be used well or badly. So, wealth is an example. We can also think of physical health. It's nice to be healthy, right? I mean, in this time of coronavirus, we're very concerned with it. We wash our hands, and socially distance, and I wear a mask when I go outside. I know a lot of my fellow citizens here in Milwaukee don't. Maybe they have a very different attitude towards physical health. And it's something that we can decide to use well or use poorly. I could use my vitality to rob banks. I mean, probably not. I probably would be a bad bank robber because it's not in my skill set, but you get the idea, right? Or randomly accost people on the street and knock them down or things like that. So health can be used in all sorts of ways. And we can talk about all sorts of other examples as well. And this brings us to the issue of virtue. The Stoics are virtue ethicists, and we'll talk about the specific virtues a bit. One common mistake that got made, not just in the present, but also in the ancient world, was thinking that because virtue is good and indifferent things are not good, they're indifferent, that virtue would not be concerned with things that are indifferent. That to be virtuous would actually be to like push those things away. Don't get too entangled with them. Don't focus on those things at all. In fact, the opposite is the case for Stoics. It wasn't the case for some other philosophers, including somebody who was very close to Zeno, the founder of Stoicism. He had a student called Aristo, or maybe an associate. We're not quite sure whether they were, on a peer level or, one was a student. Aristo said that virtue is the only thing that matters, and indifference, we don't have to care about them at all. As a matter of fact, so long as we're virtuous, that's great. The only thing that could possibly be bad would be being vicious. And so, the Stoics rejected what we can call indifferentism, thinking that, well, anything that's indifferent, it's all really on the same level. None of it matters very much. And Cicero has Cato tell us, and there's no reason to think that this wasn't Cato's view, and Cato's view would just be the orthodox Stoic view. If we maintain that all things were completely indifferent, the whole of life would be thrown into confusion and no function or task could be found for wisdom, since there would be absolutely no distinction between the things that pertain to the conduct of life and no choice need be exercised among them. See, for the Stoics, in order to exercise wisdom, you have to evaluate things. You can't be totally detached from them. You can be detached in the sense of recognizing that indifferent things are indifferent, that they're not genuinely good or bad. But that doesn't mean withdrawing from them. That doesn't mean putting up a wall and saying, I don't think about these sorts of things. If you think about the people who do that, it's usually motivated by some sort of rejection on their part. This we might call it hyper-ascetic attitude. That isn't genuine Stoicism. It wasn't genuine Stoicism back in the day. It's not genuine Stoicism for modern Stoicism. Seneca in letter 92, he talks about pursuing and using preferred indifference. And he says that taking them is an exercise of good judgment. And some of the examples that he gives are putting on clean clothing, taking a walk in the proper way, and dining as we should. And he says that the key thing there is an intention of maintaining, proper measure that pertains to reason. And you see what he's saying there is that the wise person uses, and he uses this word, natural tools at his disposal or her disposal in order to accomplish the right things. And there's actually a nice discussion there about, why cleanliness is important for the human being. And if you think about this, you could say, well, you Stoics, why do you care whether I'm in rags that are dirty and falling apart, or putting on a nice clean shirt and taking a shower every so often? Why does that matter at all? Isn't that totally indifferent? And they would say, yes, it is indifferent. But you've been given the body, you've been given the things, you ought to use them in the right way. Letter 82, where he's talking about courage, he says that, and this is very interesting, nothing is glorious that does not involve indifference. Illness, pain, poverty, death, none of these are glorious in itself, but nothing is glorious without them. They give us, you could say, the ballast against which we can push off, or they give us something to fight against or resist. He says that virtue meets these and handles them. Another thing that he says in that letter is that each object takes on a splendor, not its own, when virtue is added to it. So it's not suffering as such that somehow ennobles us. It's displaying courage in relation to suffering. That is what ennobles us. A lot of people tend to, treat being victimized today as if that somehow is heroic, right? And the Stoics would say, no, you can, bad things can happen to you, and you can have responses to them that are not virtuous, but rather vicious. For example, displacing it onto other people, repeating, say, a cycle of abuse. That would actually be a bad use of those things. In On the Happy Life, which is a really nice short work, if you haven't read that work by Seneca, it's well worth taking a look at. he talks again about wealth, and I mentioned we would get back to wealth. He says that the virtuous person and the foolish person might both pursue and use wealth. And Seneca was a rich guy, right? And he drew upon his contacts in order to make his money. A lot of people criticize him and say, how could you be a Stoic when you were so rich? And what he had to say, and you can decide whether you think that he's entirely consistent with this or not, but I think the general point is quite good. He says that the virtuous person and the foolish person both can pursue and use wealth, but in the case of the wise person, wealth is in servitude. It's being used as a tool. On the part of the foolish person, wealth is in command. So the desire, what we often call greed, which the Greeks recognized as a major problem way back then. They even had a special term for it, pleonexia, right? Wanting more than you deserved. Or thinking that money by itself is going to provide you with security or with happiness. These are things that will take people off track. And the Stoics recognize that when people do that, it's because they've got some vicious dispositions. They may be foolish, they may be unjust, they may be cowardly. And courage and cowardice doesn't just have to do with fear. It can also do with willingness to endure toil. It's called philoponia. Or industriousness, or magnanimity, rising above things, and then self-control. So one of the things that I think we want to think about when we're talking about the indifference, and much of our life is really concerned with these indifferents, whether Zoom works or not, indifferent, right? Whether, I turn the lights on or off, indifferent. If the coffee is an indifferent. All these things that we're surrounded with. We want to think about how do the virtues, you might say, not just command from on high, but penetrate into all the aspects of our lives. That's what a Stoic would say is important. Correspondingly, if we find that we have vices, we will usually discover that they have also managed to penetrate deep roots into all the parts of our life that we have to slowly, I don't know if any of you do any gardening. There are some plants that when you're weeding, you can't just pluck it out, right? You have to slowly ease it out and get the root system. And then you discover that there's more of that there. And you come back the next week and find that there's new sprouts for that kind of plant. These sort of analogies, I think, can be quite helpful in thinking about virtue and vice. So, with each of the Stoic virtues, we'll remind, what they are. Wisdom, which not only has to do with, thinking about heavenly things, but very much about earthly, mundane, everyday things. What's good for us, what's bad for us, how, we ought to treat other people, motivational structures, those sorts of things. That all falls in wisdom. Justice, how it is that we ought to be treating other people in practice, realizing our social nature, following through on commitments that we've made. Those are all aspects of justice. Courage, I've already talked about that quite a bit. And then temperance or self-control, which isn't for the Stoics just about bodily desires. It pertains to all sorts of other things as well that we could have, wrongly oriented or wrongly structured desires or aversions about. Each of these can apply to indifference. And if we do it well, according to the Stoic sort of narrative, we eventually become happy, or at least happier, less miserable. And if we screw it up, or we do it in a lackadaisical way and don't pay attention to what we're doing, or tell ourselves all sorts of false stories about, how courageous we are when we really aren't, we're going to be miserable because of the way in which we've used indifference. The last thing I want to talk about that I think kind of ties this moral side together about use and virtues. Many people, when they first read Stoic authors like Marcus Aurelius or Epictetus or Seneca, they come away with this sense that the Stoics are very duty-driven. That's all, they talk about that a lot, right? You have duties to do this, and you got to follow through on them. Now, again, you might say, stuff is really indifferent. Who cares? Why should I have these duties to fulfill? And most of the duties that we do in fact have, or appropriate actions, if you don't like the word duty because it's got too much of a moralistic sense, just use appropriate actions, which is a perfectly good legitimate translation of the Greek kathekon and the Latin officium. Most of these have to do with things that are within the realm of the indifferent. And so I'll go a little bit further with that. Stoics would actually say that our family, our neighbors, are strictly speaking indifferents to us as well. We have to qualify that pretty heavily. They are persons. They do matter as persons. They are like their own, little world onto themselves. But even the people that I'm closest to, my immediate family, my long-standing friends, colleagues who I hold in great respect, they are something external. They are something indifferent. That doesn't mean that I don't have all sorts of important relations to them. And this is where, the Stoics, we can talk about. There's actually a really wonderful book by Brian Johnson. It's either Johnson or Johnston, called The Role Ethics of Epictetus, that goes into this quite well. And the Stoics say that we have a whole panoply of moral obligations that are essentially arising from the relationships that we either found ourselves in or have willingly placed ourselves in. And fulfilling those is often a matter of how we use indifference. I'll give you just an example from my own life. So my daughter is 18 now and is going off to college. She's actually coming up here to Milwaukee to go to University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee and enroll in the musical theater program, which she was accepted into. And there's all sorts of decisions that have to be made, many of which have to do with finances and filling out paperwork and stuff like that. Now, a Stoic would not actually say, none of that stuff matters. That's all just indifference. How I actually do those things. Do I do them diligently? Do I plow through all the different things that I have to do and, try to help her with finding financial aid and try to model for her what following through on these phone calls would look like? That, these are all within the scope of what it means to be a parent, I suppose you could say. All of those things bear on indifference, but they have the possibility of creating virtue for her as a developing human being, and also expressing, I mentioned the emotions earlier, what the Stoics would call familial affection, philostorge, which they thought was incredibly important. Marcus will also talk about love quite a bit. These are things that can be done with the indifference within the framework or the fabric of our relationships. And so what we do with them is not indifferent. What we do with them is either good or bad, or a mixture of both. And, to bring this to a close, what we can see is that the whole notion of the indifference is quite a bit more complicated than it's sometimes presented, where there's, good, that's virtue, bad, vice, everything else doesn't really matter, it's all indifferent, just withdraw yourself from it. That's not a Stoic point of view. And you won't find that being espoused in Seneca or Marcus or Epictetus or in these other works that I've mentioned. And so duties or moral obligations, virtues, use, these are all, you might say, lenses through which we can see what the right path at each moment that we need to take with respect to these indifferents are. That's all I've got. It looks like I've talked for maybe about 25 minutes or so. I know there's a lot of questions.
Yes. So Greg, that was great. I'm going to ask just one clarificatory question. I want to take kind of, get out, I want to not use the term indifferent and try to pose the same question. Okay.
Yeah.
So Stoic ethic is a virtue ethic. It's a virtue ethic. And the alternative to that is a value ethic.
No,
so
I don't accept that.
Okay, let me complete the question and then you can disagree. So most people kind of automatically start thinking in terms of value ethic, of saying, is this of value to me or is this not value to me? It looks like the term indifferent is saying that it has nothing to do with virtue. Indifferent is something that is nothing to do with virtue directly, but it
Yes,
can have
that's right. Yeah,
directly. It doesn't uh, have to do with virtue directly.
yeah.
But at the same time, Stoics seem to say that there are values. So values are being expressed as preferred indifferent, as
Mhm.
opposed to so mapping this Stoic terminology of indifference into this is the way I see it, mapping into kind of virtue ethic and value ethic. Is that fair, or is that not?
Well, I'll say this. So I think I usually resist these kind of dichotomies of splitting things down the middle, because when we get into substantive looks at things, most virtue ethics are quite complex and do have all sorts of value aspects, and a lot of ethics of value. I think about Max Scheler, for example, right? There's plenty of room for virtue in what he's talking about. But let's say we accept that sort of split. I guess that could work. There probably aren't any better ways of talking about what the Stoics call the indifference. And this was a problem even back in their own time. They coined this terminology. But I will say that what you're proposing isn't worse than what
Uh-huh.
they're saying.
All right.
Right? I think it's subject to its own. These wind up being technical terms, right?
Sure.
And we have the same challenges as we're using them. There isn't any nice intuitive, like, at least in English, maybe there is in other languages, there's no easy, nice way to re-express this
Okay.
that gets it across. And
Got
that's
it.
kind of a shame.
Yeah, got it. All right. So now I just want to give heads up to you, Greg, and to everybody else. We've got already 8 questions in the pipeline,
Cool.
and lots more will come as we start asking the questions. So please keep the questions coming. The rule is that I will call on people. When I call on you, just unmute yourself, ask the question, and mute yourself back. No follow-up questions. We want to get to as many questions as possible. Okay, and keep asking questions. We'll just line up the questions, and let's try to keep the answers also reasonably brief so we can get to as many questions as possible. All right, so I'm going to tell you the order of questions now. It's going to be Ina, followed by Bartogil, followed by Helios, Greg, Kate, Alex, Sam, and Aurora. Ina, you're next. Go ahead.
Hi, I have a question. Does opinions that other people have of you, do they matter? I mean, are they indifferent? If somebody has a good opinion, like a public opinion, like about something about you, is it indifferent or preferred indifferent? That's my
Yeah.
question.
So that's a great question, and we can talk about it like in terms of the individual, and then like sort of like larger scale, like what your society thinks about you, right? So public, we could call it social status or public opinion of oneself. That's a preferred indifferent, right? It's better if people like you. It's worse, but not in the sense of like leading to happiness or misery if people think that you're a bad person when you're not, right? And a lot of our judgments about other people are whether they're good or bad people in what respects. And so you can say that too about the individual thing. So if my daughter is mentioning, she comes up here to college, and let's say she decides that, she starts taking some classes and she's like, I think my professors are way smarter than my dad. I'm not going to listen to him about anything. He's an idiot. Okay, so that's a very strong judgment and opinion about me, right? The Stoics would say that's still within the realm of the indifference. And if I want to be happy, it's probably better not to care too much about that. Now, on her part, as the individual that she is, it's not indifferent, because it's not good to have wrong-headed ideas about things. Maybe it's not wrong-headed. Maybe the professors she has will be better than me. In that case, it would be quite good. But if I have the wrong view about you, that's an indifferent to you from the Stoic perspective, but that's not an indifferent where I'm sitting, because I'm the one who's actually, in some respect, damaged or harmed by having wrong views about things. Think about products, right? So if I don't like a certain brand of butter and I won't buy it, that's within the realm of the indifference. But if I'm so fixated on it that if I need to use butter to make omelets or something, and I won't use it because it's the only one in the refrigerator, I'm kind of badly off. Does that
All
help?
right. All right. So the next one, again, let me remind everybody,
Thank you.
folks, keep your questions. Just a second. Okay, I don't know what happened. I'm back. All right. Folks, keep your questions as short as possible so we can get to as many questions as possible and keep asking more questions. All right. Next up is Bartorgil. I'm not sure I'm pronouncing the name correctly, but go ahead.
Yeah, that's fine. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, so first of all, thanks so much for the talk. I'm really big fan of your YouTube channel and I follow a lot of the videos. And yeah, first of all, I want to express that. And
Well, thanks.
yeah, my question is mostly personal. I'm very interested in like what keeps you internally motivated, like especially in philosophy, and how do you like learn about all of these philosophers, these concepts, and how do you explain them so clearly to people? Yeah. Sorry.
Okay.
It
Yeah.
might
Well,
be a lot of questions.
no, those are actually really good questions, and some of them I don't actually know the answer to. When you've been doing something, I've been studying philosophy either as a student or as a professor for 30 years now. And so some of these things become a matter of habit, and it's hard to get a good sense of like, well, what did I do back then? I don't really remember. I know that having to go through the really rigorous comps and preliminary exams that we had back in the day that no longer exist, because they were kind of an academic hazing, was incredibly helpful for me because I had to, learn mass amounts of the history of philosophy and like store it all in my head. And it's sort of like going through an intensive, exercise regimen. Your body still retains quite a bit of it later on. That said, it's, I don't really think that hazing is a great idea for people. What I can talk about is so the passion for philosophy, and I can talk about like being able to talk about it in a accessible way. I would say, in a way, I'm kind of coasting on other people's achievements. I don't do a lot of original work of my own, and nor do I want to. I'm sort of like, I tell people I'm a salesperson. I'm selling Aristotle, or I'm selling the Stoics. I have a product that, if I do a good job, it sells itself. I really enjoy the things that I study. I'm people say, who's your favorite philosopher? I don't have one because I like to read so many different people, and I see applications to ordinary life. I think it also helps that I didn't come from an academic family, and I didn't intend originally to go to college. I worked and then went in the military and came out and worked and then finally went to college. And my first teaching jobs, my first main one was teaching in a maximum security prison. And I've always taught what are called service classes, so intro to philosophy, ethics, critical thinking. And a lot of professors view those as kind of like slumming. I'm wasting my time with these non-majors. I want to be teaching my graduate level class on Hegel. But and it is nice to get to teach graduate level classes, but the real apprenticeship for doing philosophy in a way that can connect up with ordinary people are those service classes. Because you have a whole class of people who don't want to be there, and they have no idea what philosophy is, or if they do, it's probably they got it from some high school teacher who may have been cool or may have been a jerk, and you're going to have to make these things connect with them. So doing that year after year after year turned out to be really good for me. It developed those skills, and I think if you can. It's one thing to teach graduate students or even philosophy majors. They're already sold on the thing that you're doing, and they know the terminology, and they can come up with examples, and they're all kind of go-getters anyway. Being able to talk to business majors, fashion majors, culinary arts majors, people like that, that is that's where you really test yourself, whether you can get ideas across. And it's fun too. Another thing, I'm going a little bit outside of the scope of the question, but I like teaching those kinds of majors because you can use their experiences and what happens in their field for raw material and say, can Plato actually say something about this? Maybe if not, then screw Plato. But usually it turns out they can once we dig deep enough. So
Excellent. Next question is from Helios. So let me tell you the order. It's Helios, Greg, Kate, Alex, Sam, Aurora, Francoisi, and Carl next. Helios, go ahead. Helios, you're on mute. Okay, let's go to the next person. Greg. Greg, go ahead. Greg, we can't hear you. Okay, let's go to the next. I don't know what's going on with the, let's try the next one. Kate, go ahead.
Hi, everybody. That's okay, because I have two questions.
Keep them brief, okay?
Okay, sure. So the first one is if you can expand a little bit about the idea that what is good is what in accordance with nature. I would love to hear what that means. And the second one, it seems as if, I'm not sure if I understood it correctly, but it seems as if there's a spectrum of good on one hand, bad on the other, and then indifferent in the middle. And we can have the freedom to make use of either good or bad in what's in the middle, and the indifferent. And I'm thinking, can't we say that about the entire spectrum, that we decide what use to make out of everything?
Well, you can't make good use out of vice. So it's not all sort of on the same level. And, if you are genuinely virtuous, you're not going to make bad use out of courage or wisdom or things like that. You could think of it, if you want to represent it visually, it's like, you've got virtue and vice and the other associated things that are genuinely good on a higher level. And then you can say there's a spectrum beneath it of the indifference, but none of the value across that spectrum winds up sort of leaping to the level of the good or the bad. So what was the first one again? It was
about what does it mean that what is good is what is
in accordance with nature. Yeah. So the Stoics think, and this in accordance with nature is a very complicated idea. It's one that I'm actually writing a book about because it gets used a lot, and there's a lot of different discussions of it running throughout the Stoic texts. In sort of a thumbnail sketch of it, everything that exists has its particular nature, and you could say its principles of development. In this respect, the Stoics are kind of similar to Aristotelians or other philosophers who think there's a teleology to things. And as opposed to the other animals, because we're rational animals, at a certain point, we move to a different level, and we begin to recognize something that transcends the natural impulses that we have as animals towards, for example, staying alive and doing, certain things with our own kind. We recognize, according to the Stoics, the value of truth, understood not just as something useful, but having intrinsic value in itself. And we come to understand in some dim way the right and the wrong as not just being, what produces, what we might call lower level good outcomes or bad outcomes. And, that's one place where the Stoics kind of differ from other thinkers like the Epicureans. So developing that nature is part of what it means to live in accordance with nature. A lot of it involves living, choosing, acting in accordance with the virtues. And it gets more complicated yet, because when we have the virtues, usually we don't have them fully developed. So we're kind of figuring it out as we go along. The picture gets clearer and clearer and clearer the more virtuous that we become. And correspondingly, the more vicious we become, the more unclear it gets, or we have the wrong sort of clarity. We think we have everything figured out, and we actually have things quite wrong.
Okay.
Yeah.
The next question is from Greg. I'm going to read it out. Greg says, I know you've covered McIntyre in the recent past on your YouTube channel. Can you compare and contrast the Stoic concept of virtue being the proper use of indifference, parenthetically, playing the game well, and McIntyre's concept of gaining internal goods within a practice?
Well, I would say that's only part of what virtue is. But we can talk about, proper use of indifference. There's also, virtue also uses the things that are genuinely good well too, like say one's friendship. Now McIntyre, the notion of he wouldn't say gaining, he would say like achieving or attaining internal goods within a practice. Internal goods are those that can only be realized within a particular practice or an analogous practice. So he likes the example of chess. It's not the only game that you can develop certain goods of strategic thinking and all that. You could probably also do it with Go, but you probably can't do it with checkers in the same way, or backgammon in the same way. And there's all sorts of other practices that he talks about as well. I would say that there's a lot of overlap there, but that we have a different emphasis, right? McIntyre doesn't think that virtues are just about achieving internal goods either. And there's so much overlap between McIntyre and the Stoics, even though McIntyre himself didn't see it, that Anthony Long wrote a piece specifically saying, hey, McIntyre, you're talking about this Aristotelian tradition and all of these interesting elements of it. Stoicism also has this as well. So I would say that if you look at what McIntyre himself has to say about Stoicism, you come away with the idea that he didn't read as deeply as he probably ought to have. And I say this as somebody who really, actually loves and respects McIntyre. I got to study under him years ago, and I'll tell you that when it comes to virtue ethics, he's the genuine deal. He actually practices what he preaches. So he's I won't say he's a sage, but he's pretty darn close. But even sages have sort of blind spots to them. So I would say that there isn't that much contrast between them. They're emphasizing different aspects.
Okay. Next question. So let me give you again heads up. It's Alex, Sam, Aurora, Francoise, Carl, Kevin, and Timon, and ST next. Alex, you're next. Go ahead.
Great. Thanks, Shrikant. Hi, Greg.
Hey.
This is Alex from Toronto.
Yeah.
Thanks for your talk. I really appreciate actually that this topic is coming up, because there's something here that for me is always a confusing thing about the Stoics. And I guess I'm wondering about kind of like the deeper, maybe the physics or the metaphysics behind this question of virtue versus indifference. And so it seems to me like the things that matter, the things that are good and bad, have to do with the use of our freedom. And the things that are external in some way end up being indifferent. And for me, that opens the question of the difference between mind and body for the Stoics. I'm wondering.
Well, there isn't one.
There isn't one, right? So
they're materialists. Yeah.
Right, I've heard that. But then, how do they make? What is that difference then between this sense of an inner world or an inner freedom? And so Marcus talks about this, for example, going within.
Oh yeah, the inner citadel, right?
Something like that. You're right. Yeah.
Epictetus also talks about inner citadels, but they're where the vices hide. So not all the inner citadels are the places you want to go to. Yeah, I think it's better to look at it as like the human being is kind of like this thing inside, and there's like a membrane, whatever we want to call it, between them and the external world. But then there's all these ways in which the external world penetrates into us, and where we're connected with it. Our desire goes out to meet things. So it's not like there's like a little boundary that is made of iron and everything inside is our freedom area and everything outside isn't. It's more like, and in a way, it's sort of like we're this messy boundary that sometimes like extends itself further out than it should, and then gets taught a object lesson about don't do that, but then in a lot of cases has to do that. I mentioned that we're doing the Stoic parenting meetup earlier today, and one of the things that we all talked about is how when you have kids, your whatever you want to call it, your region of vulnerability to the world vastly increases, because you've got these little creatures that almost seem hell-bent on injuring or killing themselves or doing stupid things all the time until they develop some guidance systems of their own. So I think that it's the Stoics are materialists. They think that you can use terms like soul and body, but what you're really talking about is something that's a continuum of substance. And I think what they're saying fits in very well with materialist ways of looking at things now. You think about our brains, right? They are up here, but they're kind. I mean, look at what we're doing right now. We're in this communication with each other. It's not like we're just these isolated things that are passing signals back and forth. There's something more happening. And then every time that happens, we become vulnerable. And so I think the Stoics are teaching us how to manage that more effectively, if that makes sense. I don't know if that fully answers what you're...
Excellent. Next question. I just want to make sure that as many people get a chance to ask the questions. So let's not do follow-ups so that we can get to everybody. Sam is next. Sam, go ahead.
My question is essentially that is there like some major chasm between Epicureanism and Stoicism? In our world, Epicureanism is usually associated with just wanton gluttony and living the quote good life unquote. But thing is, in the ancient world, or at least some Epicureans thought that all you need for a good time is a bowl of figs and conversation with friends, which it's not quite Stoicism, but it's not luxurious living either. Just curious what your thoughts on that.
Yeah, there were some real big differences between the Stoics and the Epicureans on some key issues. So the Epicureans, they genuinely thought that pleasure or freedom from pain and trouble is the good, and everything else has to be centered around that, and that would guide your practical reasoning and decision making. And the Stoics said pleasure is a preferred indifferent. It's nice if you have it, but you don't actually need to have it. And what's most important is the honestum, the morally good, the noble, however we want to translate it. And that led to different ideas about how you ought to live your life in relation to other people. So the Epicureans deliberately withdrew as much as possible from what we translate as politics, but really it means social life. It means engagement with your neighbors and people like that. Now, modern day Epicureans, and there is a large neo-Epicurean movement out there, I think they've put quite a bit of that aside. They are quite often involved in like neighborhood groups or in local politics or things like that. But the classic Epicureans withdrew as much as possible from that. Although, it's interesting. There is a discussion of it in Cicero's On the Ends, Book 1, where this one Epicurean tries to make the case that everything that these other virtue ethics perspectives, like the Aristotelians and Stoics, everything that they do, we've got that too, but it's all because it leads to a more pleasant life. I don't know that anyone was really that convinced by it. And Cicero takes book 2 to deconstruct all of that afterwards. The Stoics thought that you really need to be involved in your community. Not in such a way that you're like constantly jockeying for power or things like that, but they thought that you live within a matrix of relationships, and those have duties, and you shouldn't try to withdraw from it. And that there were a lot of polemics between the Stoics and Epicureans on that very point. So I think you can say that they are. There are some points of similarity, but even the notion of like tranquility isn't the same from the Stoics to the Epicureans.
Let's go next to Aurora. Aurora, go ahead.
Yes, hi. My question is, what is your opinion on having standards? Isn't having a standard a form of pride, which is a dispreferred indifferent?
No, I mean, having standards isn't necessarily prideful. I think there are a lot of people who sort of egocentrically impose their standards in prideful ways, but the old saying goes, the abuse doesn't negate the proper use of the thing. Everybody's got standards of one form or another, even if it's just what's good is what's good for me, a pure egoist. So I don't see how you can get away from having standards. The question is whether you can get better and better standards or not. And it's interesting that you bring up pride, and I'm going to like totally shift gears here. So one of the other people that I do work on is John Cassian, this monastic author, and he's one of the people that we eventually get the 7 deadly sins from in Christian literature, which were originally the 8 capital vices in the Desert Fathers with Cassian and Evagrius Ponticus. And he talks about pride as being, this really problematic thing because it can use even the virtues as raw material for its activities. If I'm a courageous person, I could be prideful about my courage, right? So there is a danger to look out for there, and maybe the Stoics aren't sufficiently attentive to that. One of the common criticisms of the Stoics, made not in the ancient times, but in the Renaissance and early modern period, was that they were too prideful about the capacities of human beings. That they didn't take into account what at that time they called depravity, what we could call our usual state of screwed upness. So maybe the Stoics weren't sufficiently attentive to that, but I don't think that having standards by itself is prideful.
Okay. Now, last 4 questions are from Françoisie, Carl, Kevin, and Timon. Françoisie, go ahead.
Yes. Hi, Greg. My question is about fun. Because in that middle of good and bad, you talked about pleasure, but fun is a little bit different.
Yeah.
What you call indifference has always been a bit cold to me. So I find to be more of an Epicurean to have fun. And I see between your smile and your sparkling eyes that you're having fun with a Stoic. Were you finding that fun?
Yeah, and some people think I joke around too much too.
Thank God.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. If we look at the classical Stoics, some of them we can say were definitely not fun people. Cato is a great example. Really wonderful guy, but I do not think there was anything fun about him at all. With Epictetus, there's some humor going on there, but you got to really like dig into it to find it. And this is actually a great question because it's come up when we have this annual Stoicon every year, right? Which unfortunately is going to be virtual this time around because of the COVID crisis. But we all get together and we like have presentations and we talk about things, and we do indeed have a lot of fun together. And then some people come along and they're like, "You're not being properly Stoic." Or if I say I'm excited to go to Stoicon, well, that's not Stoic either. I think that this is one of the areas where there's the classical things are not that helpful for us, and where modern Stoicism has to forge a new path. Interestingly, I'll tell you this: they do this psychological assessment stuff with Stoic Week every year, and one of the categories that Tim Laban found that the greatest rise in what was called zest, which is closely, it's not the same thing as fun, but it's closely related to it, this like capacity to get enjoyment out of life. And he was like, that's kind of a weird result. Why would doing Stoic practices lead to this? And the answer, we never really did figure out the answer. Maybe there's something about doing the discipline that liberates a space in which you can do that. Because having fun requires spontaneity and a certain kind of freedom, right? Not to take things so seriously. But this is a very good thing to think about. Yeah.
Thanks.
Oh, you're welcome.
Next question is from Carl.
Yes, thank you. If one was interested in creating an imaginary utopia other than Plato's Republic, would you recommend any other philosophers who study utopia or talk about the ideal?
Well, as it so happens, Zeno wrote a book called The Republic as well, and we just don't have it, unfortunately. And it could be good for the reputation of Stoicism that we don't, because apparently not only did he advocate like free love, but so that maybe cannibalism is okay, and nobody quite knows what to make of that. There were in ancient philosophy, there's literary stuff, some of which is kind of silly, like Lucian of Samsota. I don't know if you've ever read him. He's a very fun author. He's a satirist, and he's also the first science fiction author with his true history. But I don't know that anything he does is a serious, like, let's sit down and try to come up with a blueprint for the perfect society sort of thing. There's Thomas More's Utopia, of course. And there's a lot of stuff coming after that about perfect societies. You might say there was actually a kind of cottage industry. There is an interesting thing from a feminist perspective, Christina Pizan's Book of Ladies, which advocates, like an ideal city in which women don't have quite the hard time that they have on the outside because of all the stuff that the men are doing and can be taken seriously. I don't know. That's actually a good question. I don't have a very good sort of synoptic view on utopian literature, unfortunately.
Okay. Next up is Kevin. Kevin, go ahead.
Hi. I just wanted to ask, do you see any parallels in the notion of indifference with Deleuze's notion of difference? Would you say they're both against the trope of identity?
That I have to punt on because it's been a long time since I've been reading anything other than Logic of Sense when it comes to Deleuze, and I don't want to get things wrong, sure. Unfortunately.
Fair enough. Next one up is Timon. Timon, go ahead.
Hi. Thanks for doing this, Greg.
Oh, sure.
Yeah, you mentioned briefly before that moral progress or moral development is preferred and different. Can you clarify what you mean by that? Because it seems like indifference are things we could do without, right? Can we do without moral development?
Not if we want to get to virtue, right? But by itself, I guess, and this is something where you asked, can I clarify it? Not too well, because we're not quite sure what the Stoics meant by saying it. We get this one offhand remark, and then we get all this other stuff where the Stoics are constantly stressing how important it is that we devote ourselves to moral development. And it's coming from Diogenes Laertes, who's not himself a Stoic, but is reporting on what the Stoics, what their standard doctrine was. So, I mean, the closest, the best stab that I have at it is that they had to place it in there because it wasn't yet at the point of having attained the virtues. It's good if you can do it, but it doesn't in and of itself get you there. And that's a weird thing to say because if anything gets us to the virtues, wouldn't it be making the continual effort of developing? So it may be one of those areas where the Stoics are actually just incoherent. But I don't quite know what to make of it at this point.
All right, folks, so that brings us to the end of the Q&A. So let me firstly thank Greg, but I'll come back to you. I'll give you the last word here, but let me tell you what's coming up. So next week, we are going to have Dr. Walter Metwichuk, and he's going to be talking about Stoicism and REBT, that is Rational Emotive Behavioral Therapy. On May 16th, Greg Lopez, our friend, is going to be back, and he's going to be talking about the difference between Stoic approach to mindfulness and Buddhist approach to mindfulness. On May 23rd, Massimo will be back, and he will be talking about pandemic as exile and what Seneca would have to say about it. So that's what is coming up. So now what we're going to do is we are going to split into groups of about 5-6 people each, so we can talk about these ideas. Greg has put a lot of thinking material on the table, and we can talk about how it applies to our lives. So that's what we're going to do. So Greg, it was an honor to have you here. And any last words before we go?
Nothing actually comes to mind other than to thank you for inviting me and all the good questions. And I will say too, having seen all three of the people who you mentioned coming, they're all really good speakers. So you're all in for a treat.
Yes.